Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. This is Bethany O'Connor from the USAID-funded Health Policy Plus project, and I am so delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, What to Expect When You're Projecting, Interrogating Population Projections and Their Fertility Assumptions. We have a great broadcast for you today, and we'll begin with just a few announcements. First, this session is being recorded, and we will post the recording to the HP Plus webinars page within about a week. We would love to hear from you. We welcome your questions at any time. Please submit your questions via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will read them aloud when we pause for questions. Next, these web conferencing platforms are getting a high volume of traffic, as we all know. So if we encounter any glitches, just don't worry, we'll get it back up and running as soon as we can, and we thank you in advance for your patience. Finally, we ask that if you're not speaking, that you please mute yourself to keep the line nice and quiet while others are talking. And that concludes the little announcements portion. So now let's meet our panelists. Next slide, please. So today we're going to hear from Jay Gribble from HP Plus Palladium, Kaya Yurchinska from HP Plus Palladium, Toshiko Kanada from PACE PRB, and also Stella Kigozi Makumbi from the National Population Council in Uganda. An absolutely amazing panel, and we're so excited to hear from them today. And now that we've met our panelists, let's go to the next slide and look at our agenda. So we'll have an introduction from Jay Gribble, followed by a discussion of an overview of the population projections, their assumptions and key results. Then we'll talk about which crystal ball should you trust, understanding population projections for high fertility countries. Then we'll talk about understanding and using population projections, the case of Uganda and other countries. Then we'll have Q&A and some closing remarks from Jay Gribble. So now that we've previewed our agenda, it is time to jump in. It's my absolute pleasure to hand it over to my colleague, our Senior Technical Director at HP Plus, Jay Gribble. Jay?
Thank you, Bethany. So what should we expect when we're projecting populations? It's an important question to the global health and demographic communities, as population is a critical dimension to both short and long-term planning in virtually every sector, including healthcare, education, housing, and agriculture. Having an idea of population size and composition affects what we need and want and what we produce. And the size and age distribution of populations will affect consumption patterns, which affect our environment, the availability of natural resources, and climate. Regardless of the country we consider, understanding the size and age structure is critical to decision-making today, as well as at any point in the future. Today's webinar focuses on future fertility patterns, which are a key input into estimation of future population size. The way demographers estimate how fertility will evolve is based on uncertainty, relying on diverging methodologies for estimating and forecasting. These differences may not be noticeable in a 5-year projection, but they can make a big difference in a 50-year projection. Our presenters will consider 3 sets of projections. By considering how organizations making these projections deal with fertility assumptions, we gain some insights into what to expect when they make their projections. But countries themselves also develop their own population projections, and we will hear about how Uganda develops its own projections. Projections also include assumptions about mortality and migration, but fertility is the key driver of population change in most lower and middle income countries, and that's our rationale for focusing on fertility today. The USAID-supported Health Policy Plus and PACE projects are committed to creating evidence that supports equitable policy environments. Our goal for today's webinar is to help each of us become better consumers of information. We don't support one methodology over another, but we do think that understanding assumptions used in projections helps us to think critically and push the field forward. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Kaya Yurchinska.
Many thanks, Jay, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. So during this presentation, we'll be covering the basics of population projections. What are they? On what assumptions are they based? And then we'll examine key results across population sources. So to begin, what exactly is a population projection? Well, a population projection is a conditional expectation based on assumptions we make about three components of demographic change in the future, and they are fertility, mortality, and migration. Projections are sometimes also called forecasts, and while these two terms are used to effectively connote each other today, a forecast has historically been a projection in which the assumptions are considered to yield a pretty realistic picture of the future. As Jay noted in his intro, population projections are essential for informing planning and decision-making, and we'll hear much more about that during the course of today's session. But importantly, there are multiple institutions and government bodies producing as well as consuming population projections, just a handful of which you can see pictured here. And also, as Jay mentioned, during today's discussion, we're only going to profile three of these many institutions and governments involved in this space. Of course, we all understand that the future cannot be known with absolute confidence. Therefore, the assumptions that we make about the future course of fertility in projections is always subject to some uncertainty. And the uncertainty around the size of the future population is driven mostly by what we assume about the number of births and the pace of change in fertility over time. And as you can imagine, uncertainty grows with time. So for instance, in the near term, we can be a lot more confident about how fertility may progress, say, based on the experience of other countries, but we grow more uncertain about the future as time passes, particularly when something hasn't really been observed in other countries. So to address the inherent uncertainty in population projections, there's always a central or most likely a scenario produced. And then to demonstrate the implications of other possible futures, projections also produce some alternative scenarios and oftentimes offer prediction intervals, which are statistical bounds of uncertainty. Given this uncertainty, projections aren't always equally reliable. The quality of projections can be assessed based on two things: their internal validity, which is whether the projections accurately and consistently model relationships between demographic variables, and then also external validity, which refers to how well projections actually perform. Importantly, the difference between projection results, as we're going to see, are primarily due to their different assumptions pertaining to fertility. And typically, countries that have high fertility are projected separately from countries with low fertility, given that they're, of course, really different contexts. And so because of this, we're only going to be interrogating projections from the perspective of high fertility countries rather than some countries with low fertility, like many of those in Europe. Population projections we use today all have the same few basic ingredients, which you see here. So first, we begin with the population for a specific base year that's disaggregated by age and sex at minimum. And this is the population that we project forward. It's our starting point. Next, we need some procedure for deriving future fertility levels and the pace and timing of that change. And this is the area where we see quite a bit of variation in approaches. So future fertility can be derived using different statistical techniques into which we're embedding assumptions. For example, a statistical technique that projects fertility forward based on the historical experience of other countries. But we can also come up with these assumptions based on, let's say, expert opinion, or use hybrid approaches in which we use a combination of both. The final key ingredient is our overall projection approach. I'll bring all of this together. And the most common one is the cohort component method. And it's popular because it's actually really logical and simple and comparatively straightforward. So that kind of a projection method follows each group of people the same age and sex, exposing them to age and sex-specific fertility, mortality, and migration rates. Some projection approaches stratify the population by more than just the conventional age and sex, and they add in, for instance, education. And this is called a multi-state population projection, and it's likewise projected forward using the cohort component method. So now that we've covered those foundations, let's take a look at the three prominent population projections and do a few basic comparisons. So Our first projections are the world population prospects produced by the UN Population Division. They're the best known and most popular, and their latest release, which was produced in 2019, is actually their 26th round. Our second projections are produced by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in collaboration with the Wittgenstein Center and others, and their latest round corresponds to 2018. And finally, we have projections by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, and those are released for the first time this year. Now, each of these projections cover the full period from 2020 to 2100 and include data for most countries and regions in the world. As we can see, they all also leverage the cohort component method. A bit different from the others, though, is YASA, which creates multi-state population projections featuring education, like in the example I gave earlier. We see that each projection has a central or most likely scenario, though that tends to vary by name. We have the medium variant, the medium scenario, and the reference scenario. But each of these projection sources also feature alternative scenarios based on assumptions, different assumptions to deal with some of the inherent uncertainty. So in the case of the UN, just as one example, there are 8 alternative scenarios, 4 of which pertain to fertility, and they're called the high and low fertility variants, which they're high and low compared to the medium. There's a constant fertility, which represents no change in fertility over time, and instant replacement, meaning that all fertility levels decrease to 2.1 pretty much immediately. And you can see the different variants, alternative paths here from both YASA and IHME. Now let's take a closer look at how future fertility assumptions differ across the 3 projection sources. So the UN assumptions for high fertility countries result in a relatively steady pace of fertility decline through the end of the century. So specifically, the fertility decline for high fertility countries is projected using a pretty sophisticated probabilistic statistical technique. And here, fertility is informed by historical trends within that country, plus historical trends of other countries that have already experienced fertility decline. And here the authors generate 100,000 different fertility projections for each country. And actually the median of these trajectories is used as the median fertility variant projection. In comparison to the UN assumption for high fertility countries, both YASA and IHME projection models offer a steady but slightly faster pace of fertility decline through the end of the century. So the basis of the fertility assumption for YASA in the middle here is input from over 550 demography experts worldwide who provided feedback on a set of alternative scientific arguments that impact future demographic trajectories. Another key difference in the YASA projections is their multi-state nature and inclusion of level of education. And we know that as girls and women are educated, they experience a decline in childbearing. So in this type of projection, a change in the educational composition of the population will have actually a direct impact on fertility as well. And finally, the IHME projections, and these are quite unique from both UN and YASA. So IHME project future fertility using a statistical modeling strategy that uses past and forecasted trends in the drivers of childbearing. And the drivers of childbearing include education and met need for modern contraceptives. So what that looks like in practice is that education and met need for contraceptives are forecasted into the future, and then fertility is forecasted based on education and based on that education and contraceptive met need. Another key difference is that childbearing is measured and projected as completed cohort fertility at age 50 rather than a period measure, which they believe to simply be more stable over time. That's really the main takeaway there. So importantly, what are the implications of these different assumptions? So when we look at fertility globally, the highest end year fertility is projected by the UN, and we can see that the global fertility rate is slightly below replacement rate by 2100 at 1.9. By contrast, and unsurprisingly given the nature of their assumptions, fertility under both YASA and IHME projections reach pretty low levels, actually to around 1.6 children per woman by the end of the century. And while that difference may seem pretty small, the implications are actually quite significant. And that point is illustrated well when we take a look at the projected global population. So between now and 2100, the UN's most likely scenario projects a continuous increase in population over time, reaching 10.8 billion. On the basis of IASA's assumptions, total population peaks during the second part of the century and decreases slightly to 9.3 billion by 2100. And finally, with the most ambitious assumptions related to fertility, IHME projections show quite a substantial decline in the total population to 8.8 billion by 2100. And fertility assumptions also hold implications for the age structure of the population, which you can see visually represented through a population pyramid, which is what we have here. And under the UN's projections, the global population is gradually aging, so with larger shares of people over the age of 65 than ever before. Still, there remains a fairly abundant percentage of people in their working ages, there you can see through the middle box, in comparison to those who are considered economically dependent. So that tends to be those, again, over 65 or 70 years of age and under the age of 15 or 20. Now for the IASA projections. So in IASA, based on the fertility path, the population is older than the projections from the UN, and that's pretty considerably so by an additional 6 years on 6 additional years. We see that nearly half of the global population is in their dependent ages, with a large share over the age of 65. What we also see is that the share of working age adults is considerably smaller than the UN's projections. And finally, that brings us to IHME. We see a similar picture to IASA's projections, meaning that the share of the population in their older dependent ages is really quite high. And this is again partly or largely because of the assumed faster and more consistent decline in fertility in high income countries, or high fertility countries, excuse me. So as we can see, these projection sources imply quite different demographic futures, and that's pretty striking because, as Jay highlighted at the start, population matters for so many of the choices that we make, the things that we need, and what we can contribute. So projections are used for many reasons, and that includes anticipating our future health and education needs, distributing resources subnationally, determining our tax policies, informing different investments we make. Also, monitoring social and economic trends with demographic data serving as pretty essential denominators. And then we can also use this to manage environmental and climatic risks. So that's why understanding the difference between projections makes us best positioned to decide on which basis we'll make our decisions. And to tell us more about being smart projection consumers, I now pass it on to Dr. Toshiko Kaneda.
Thank you, Kaya. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. So as Jay and Kaya mentioned, there are a number of different groups out there producing population projections. And most recently, IHME released their brand new projections this summer. And these projections generated a lot of conversation among demographers and in the media. It's great to have more groups producing population projections, but it also makes it even more important that we carefully evaluate the assumptions underlying projections to be smart consumers. Do you see my?
Yes, perfect. We see the outline.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I'm a part of the PACE project at PRB that is funded by USAID Office of Population and Reproductive Health. And with PACE support, every year we produce the World Population Data Sheet for which we carefully evaluate and curate data on various population indicators for countries around the world. Among the indicators we present are 2035 and 2050 population projections. And for each country, we examine various available projections to evaluate which look most plausible based on current evidence. And if we don't think any look plausible, then we make our own projections. So what I'm going to share with you today about being a smart consumer of projections is all based on our own experience from years of working on the World Population Data Sheet in our own efforts to be smart consumers. So here's what I'm going to focus my talk on today. To see what types of information we need to evaluate projections, we'll compare and contrast different aspects of the projections produced by the three groups that Kaya just talked about, UN, IHME, and IASA. And since this session is focused on high fertility countries, Here we'll focus on sub-Saharan Africa, since the majority of high fertility countries are in the SSA region. I'll then discuss how the characteristics of the projections compare to what we know about fertility declines in sub-Saharan Africa. So, what to look for in evaluating population projections? As Kaya mentioned, the key ingredients of any population projection is the starting population and assumptions about trends in fertility, mortality, and migration. Demographers generally agree that where fertility is high, it will come down to a level around or below the replacement level of fertility of 2.1 children per woman. But demographers don't agree on when, how much, and how fast fertility will come down. And assumptions for each of these make a big difference in resulting population projections. And mind you, all projections are made based on various assumptions, and whether they're based on the latest evidence or fancy modeling, there will always be some uncertainty, and the projections are only as good as the underlying assumptions and data. And we know from our experience working on our data sheet that knowledge about context is critical, not only for making projections, but also in evaluating existing projections. So if you understand the methodology used by different groups to produce the projection, great. But even if you don't, there are still various things we can and should check. So first, let's start by looking at the 3 population projections for SSA. Each organization puts out multiple versions based on different demographic scenarios, but here we're looking at their reference categories or the scenarios they consider most likely. The green line refers to UN projections, reddish-orange line is for IHME, and the blue line is for EASA. So comparing the starting population size, all 3 groups use similar estimate of around 1.1 billion in 2020. But by 2100, UN projects it to reach 3.8 billion, IHME projects 3.1 billion, and EASA the lowest at 2.6 billion. So these are quite big differences. And according to IHME, a third of the difference between their total global population projection in 2100 and the UN's is due to differences in projections for SSA. So while the 21 projections differ greatly, since there's little difference in the starting populations, we know that the starting population can't be the source of differences in projections. So let's look at the country-specific TFRs in 2018, the starting level TFRs for all SSA countries used by the 3 groups. For each country here, green X's show UN TFRs, red X's are for IHME TFRs, and blue X's show EASA TFRs. And we're using the UN's TFRs as the reference category. So in other words, the SSA countries along the X-axis are ordered from highest to lowest by the UN's TFR estimates. So the other 2 estimates can be compared against the UN. The estimates surprisingly differ somewhat from one another, especially the IHME's estimates from the other 2 groups. However, looking across all these SSA countries, I don't see a particular bias. I can't see that the TFRs assumed by one group are consistently higher or lower than the TFR assumed by other groups. Now, let's look at the similar chart showing TFR projections in 2100. Here you can see that all 3 groups project TFR to decline substantially by 2100. Here, I rescale the y-axis so it's easy to see the differences. And I also drew a line at TFR of 2.1, the replacement level fertility, so you see which ones fall above and below that level. So you see that about a third of the green axis, the UN's TFRs, remain above 2.1 in 2100. So UN projects that about a third of SSA countries do not reach replacement level fertility by 2100. And this includes sizable countries like Tanzania, Niger, and Nigeria. In contrast, all ESS TFR projections in blue are below replacement level in 2100, and for IHME, all but 4 countries are projected to drop below replacement level, and actually to levels substantially lower even compared to ESS. Let's take a closer look at some countries here as examples. For example, for Tanzania, UN projects TFR in 2100 to be 2.4, so above the replacement level, while ESA projects it to be 1.8 and IHME 1.6, so 0.8 child less than UN. For Nigeria, 2100 TFR projections vary between 2.3 for UN and 1.7 for IHME, with ESA in between the two. And there are 2 other examples here on the slide. So as we look at these TFRs in 2100, I'd like you to bring to bear your context knowledge about fertility and population dynamics in these countries and consider if these rates look plausible. So based on what we know about fertility in these countries from the available survey data, historical and regional trends, and other contextual factors, we might ask ourselves if the IHME rates and many of the ESA projections appear too low. Now that we looked at the starting and ending levels of TFR, let's look in between at the pace at which TFR was assumed to decline. So here we have 3 line graphs, one for each set of projections by IHME, ESA, and UN from left to right. Each line here represents trends in TFRs between 2020 and 2100 for a given SSA country. And each graph shows these lines for all SSA countries for which data are available. Here I inserted the yellow dotted line showing the average trend line for reference. And I also inserted the line at TFR of 2.1 for the replacement fertility again. So notice where the yellow dotted line dips below the orange replacement level fertility line across the 3 projections. It happens in the 2050s for IHME and ESA, but it does not happen until the 2080s for UN projections. Now, let's quickly look at a couple of countries as examples as well. The red line represents the trends in TFR for Niger, and the green one represents the trend for DRC. So Niger starts out with the world's highest TFR at around 6.5 to 7 kids per woman. IHME and ESA assumes that Niger's TFR declines to below 2.1 in the 2080s, while the UN assumes TFR will not reach replacement level before 2100. As for the green lines for DRC, IHME and ESA assume TFR coming down to 2.1 in the 2060s, while UN assumes that it will be 2100 before that happens. So do you think these patterns of declines projected for Niger and DRC look plausible? Based on historical and regional trends, IHME and ESA's projections rates of decline really stand out. And you'll want to check these trends for the countries in which you're interested or familiar with as well. So now that we looked at the starting level TFR and ending level TFR and the pace of decline, let's look at one more thing. If we saw all the countries in the world by TFR in 2018, and again by projected 2100 TFR, there should be some consistency between a country's ranking at the 2 time points. So let's compare the list of countries with the 50 highest TFRs in 2018 to the list with the 50 highest projected TFRs in 2100 for each projection. The results for IHME presented here show some surprising findings. In 2018, of the 39 SSA countries on the list of the world's 50 highest TFRs, only 9 remain on the list in 2100, and these are the ones highlighted in blue. And what's even more surprising is that IHME projections show that 8 countries that were on the list of high TFR countries in 2018 were actually on the list of the world's 50 lowest TFRs in 2100. So this is a significant shift and suggests that IHME may be overestimating the pace of fertility decline for these and possibly other countries in the region. When we do the same comparison for the UN, we see much less jumping around. For the UN projections of the 39 countries on the list of the world's highest TFRs in 2018, 33 were on the list in 2100, and none ended up on the list of countries with the lowest TFRs in 2100. ESA's is somewhere in between the two, with less transition compared to IHME, but more than the UN. So as we consider which fertility assumptions seem most reasonable, we should see if these patterns jibe with research about the fertility transitions in SSA and what we know about the factors that affect fertility declines in the region. Research has shown that fertility transitions in SSA have started later and progressed slower compared to what we observed historically elsewhere, including Asia and Latin America. Research has found that at the given level of socioeconomic development, SSA countries have higher levels of fertility and desired family size compared to other regions. So the pattern of fertility transition appears to be quite distinct in SSA. As Kaya mentioned, IHME and ESA's models of fertility considered women's educational attainment, and in the case of IHME, also consider the met need for family planning. And we know that education and modern contraceptive use are both important factors affecting fertility, so it makes sense to include them in the models. However, research has shown that the relationship between education and fertility decline is weaker in SSA than in other regions. And so is the relationship between modern contraceptive use and fertility decline. While IHME and ESA projected faster and greater declines in many SSA countries based on improving educational attainment and met need for family planning, policies and investments made in these factors may have smaller impacts on accelerating fertility declines in SSA than elsewhere. So I'd say models which assume those relationships to be universal, such as IHME's and ESA's, are likely to overestimate the pace and magnitude of fertility decline in SSA. And that's consistent with what we just observed when we evaluated the plausibility of their fertility assumptions. So what should you take away from this as you consider various population projections? From our experience working on the world population data sheet every year, we know that there is simply no substitute for understanding the context when it comes to not only making the projections, but also being a smart consumer. We also must evaluate the assumptions underlying population projections. This is true for new projections like IHMEs and for more established ones like the UN's. And we must evaluate the assumptions using evidence from research and all we know about the particular populations being projected. Look at the starting populations and patterns of change projected and interrogate anything that does not jibe with the evidence before making your selection. On a different note, let me just say how important it is for us to support countries' demographic data collection efforts. With better information, researchers can improve their projections. So as a part of being a smart consumer, we can also support the infrastructure that makes solid projections possible and together improve on the projections. So my final thoughts, and I promise these are my final words. Projections not only allow us to prepare for the future, but also often result in policy and program changes, and so can change the future course of populations. It is our responsibility to be vigilant about what projections we choose to use. Thank you so much. Now I'm gonna pass it off to Stella.
Okay, thank you so much, Toshiko. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I want to add on to Uganda's case in understanding and using population projections. The speakers before me have talked about the global context and have also painted a pretty good picture on how the projections are collected, how they are derived. So I will start off by introducing myself again. I'm called Stella Chigozima Kumbi. I work with the National Population Council of Uganda. So Uganda, my presentation today is how global population projections are received and used in Uganda and how relevant for the work of Uganda's National Population Council and what government decisions they help to inform. It will also reflect on the potential policy and program implications of a drastically different fertility future, and finally give a few recommendations for how projections can be developed and messaged. So Uganda began its population census using population count nearly 100 years ago. And this was in 1911 when population conducted. But since 1948, there have been censuses conducted at regular intervals. And before 1998, the censuses were conducted by a department of government until when an act of parliament was passed, which established the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. And the Uganda Bureau of Statistics is the official source for government statistics. So government of Uganda utilizes data produced by the Bureau of Statistics. This data includes censuses, surveys, as well as population projections to inform government policy and programs. And as a government agency, the National Population Council utilizes the data produced by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. The National Population Council utilizes the data to inform its policy and program, ensuring policy and program coherence. It also utilizes the statistics to monitor and evaluate the population programs and advise the president on population and development matters. And I want to emphasize that the National Population Council, like other agencies, utilizes the data and projections from UBOS to support its program and policy work. Now, let's take a look at Uganda's performance across some key demographic and social economic indicators. On your screen, you can be able to see the population starting from 1991 up to 2016. Had a population of about 16.7 million, and this has grown to 34.6 million in 2016 and is currently projected at 41.5 million. There are also other indicators that show teenage pregnancy, which is a big concern in Uganda. 1991, the teenage pregnancy rate was 43%, and this came down in 2002 to 25% and has stalled at 25, 24 for the past 10, 12 years, and up to 2020, we're at 25%. On the graph, you also see the life expectancy. This is an indicator that has been improving in our country, and also GDP. As mentioned earlier, I would now like to further reflect on more population projections that are produced by Uganda Statistics. The population projections you see here show that Uganda's population may grow to 55 million by 2030. Next slide. It will grow to 55 million by 2030 and will be 84.4 million by 2040. These are the projections from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. Later on, I will show you how the statistics from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics compare with the projections that have been shared by my colleagues by the global projections. So while the government of Uganda utilizes its official statistics, next slide, it recognizes contribution of global projections, and the global projections are mostly used to inform course of action to address challenges that countries are similarly grappling with. For example, issues to do with teenage pregnancy, fertility challenges. Uganda compares itself with other countries in the region and the rest of the world to be able to see how those countries are addressing those challenges. The global statistics also provide comparative statistics on common problems in the region, continent, and globally. And the global statistics enable the country to build capacity of national agencies and decision makers. This is because global projections are usually well illustrated and easy to understand. They are a good source for sensitizing technocrats and policymakers, as well as building capacity to generate and customize lower level statistics. Finally, the global projections, along with national statistics and projections, have been used to support development of numerous policies. In Uganda, the projections combined with the national statistics have supported the development of a national on harnessing of the demographic dividend. They've also supported to build an evidence base for the third national population policy and other key flagship products that the National Population Policy Council utilizes in its advocacy and advisory work on population. So while global projections have many uses in Uganda, they do usually result in higher total population. And the next slides will be able to illustrate some of the examples where the global projections are higher than the national projections. Let's take a look at projections of Uganda's population by 2020. We're able to see the diverging population projections. You can see the one from the UNPD, you will see the one of IASA, the one of IHME, and the one of Uganda Bureau of Statistics. The projection by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics is much lower, 41.6 million, while the one from IASA highest at 47.3 million as the population for 2020. So this is a big divergence, and it is important to reflect on the reasons why such divergence exists. Now, let's take a look at how Uganda's fertility is also expected to progress. When you look at the slide in front of you, those are projections from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics showing how fertility has progressed from 2015 at 5.5 children per woman to the current figure of 5.0 in 2020. That's a projection, and moving down to 2.7 children in 2050. Those are the projections by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. So how do these compare with the global projections? we can look at the next slide. So when you look at the global projections, you will see that the projections for 2020 are 5.3 and for UPD it's 4.7, while IHME is 5.0. This, when you compare to the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, there is a divergence. Uganda Bureau of Statistics current total fertility is 5.07. So the closest to the projection by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics is IHME. So while the difference may seem small, the implications are quite significant, and the speakers before me have emphasized that point. So the diverging total population, again, we look at the projections. You will see the UNPD, IASA in blue, 80 million, IHME at 74 million, while the UBOS is at 69 million projections. Again, you see the divergence. You'll see that the global projections are usually much higher. Next. So what does that mean for total population? Uganda is aware of the uncertainty surrounding its future path, and as a result has created two fertility scenarios. The country has traditionally had a very high fertility scenario of over 5 children per woman, and as far back as I've shown you on the graph, where fertility more than 20 years ago was 7.4 children. So Uganda has derived two scenarios: a high fertility scenario of where the fertility remains at 5 children, low fertility scenario, to be able to support its planning for programs that can be able to lead the country to attain its vision 2040. Next slide, please. So we are going to look at what the implications of these diverging paths are. With continued high fertility, Uganda's population would continue to grow very fast. When you look at the red, you will see that is a projection by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. And if the population continued to grow at the current TFR, we would have, it would triple in a matter of 30 years. But under the low fertility scenario, again, that has been projected by the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, the population would grow much slower and would have implications, both implications for planning. Uganda is focusing on how to be able to address both scenarios in its planning, and in order to put programs in place that will enable it to harness the demographic dividend. So what are the key messages from this? It is important that government continues to support its investments. Next slide, please. Government should focus investments in education and education, and Toshiko talked about this in the earlier slides, that will enable the country be able to harness the demographic dividend, because as we know, socioeconomic factors play a very important role in determining fertility levels. And to achieve further reductions in fertility, Uganda should continue to promote education of females. It should be able to combat violence and discrimination against women and eliminate early forced and child marriages. But there's also the need to increase the number of family planning service points and intensify outreaches to ensure increased availability and accessibility of family planning methods. So what does this mean for how projections are developed and messaged? In my presentation, I have shown you how the global projections are usually different from the national projections, and they are usually much higher. We have looked at the fertility projections as well and the implications for the country. We have looked at how the country utilizes the global projections. So my parting message is that it is important for global projections to global projection agencies to collaborate with national statistical bodies in order to create statistics that are harmonized. Look at the statistics from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. The statistics, they are harmonized, the projections are harmonized every 10 years when there is an actual count. The global projections need to reflect on when actual counts are done so that they can be able to harmonize their global projections that stretch on up to 2100, while the ones from national statistical bodies are usually of short term. It is also important to build capacity of statistical bodies to generate, analyze, and ensure that their statistics are effectively utilized. And not least of all, it is important that the global statistical agencies also harmonize their statistics. And with that, I pass it back to Bethany for our question and answer session. I thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stella, and to all of our panelists. This has just been such a fascinating webinar, and I'm really excited to dig into the questions that have been coming in from the audience. So if you do have a question for our panelists, please go ahead and type it into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll just get started here. So the first one is from Sarah. What kind of criticism has IIHE received about their projections? Panel?
So
Hi.
Shiko, I'm wondering, oh yeah, go right ahead. I'm happy to chime in after.
You guys can chime in as well, but the criticisms that I've seen coming out have just generally been pointing out, assuming faster and greater fertility declines in many countries with high level fertilities. I can also comment on the countries with low fertility levels, but maybe it's outside of the scope. Kaya, do you want to chime in?
So yeah, I definitely agree. It relates to those fertility levels, and I would also say it also relates to the inputs or the drivers behind those fertility levels. So assuming perhaps overly optimistic trends in met need for contraception and educational attainment, when in some cases we've actually seen a bit of stagnation in one or both.
Yeah, the papers that I read pointed out the sort of lack of coherence in series of projections coming out of even the same region. You kind of expect that the countries, neighboring countries with similar socioeconomic levels and factors move together, so to speak, over time, but they were showing divergent projections, even for some of the neighboring countries. And this speaks to just maybe the lack of understanding about the context of the countries that they were working with.
Thank you so much, Toshiko and Kaya. The next thing I'm going to read is more of a comment than a question from Olanike. Global population projections have also helped for estimating unmet need and met need for family planning using the Spectrum tool, but challenges observed for small island developing states with populations below 100,000. So thanks for that, Olanike. And then the next question is from Shelley. Are there any plans for panels, meetings among IIASA, UNDP, and IHME?
You know, I'm actually not able to comment on that very well myself. The only thing that I've personally observed is following the release of the IHME projections is that I haven't seen any formal statements from YASA, and I believe UNPD have also not commented extensively on it. So, but I think certainly it would be fascinating if they could have some sort of discussion together and really discuss the differences in their approaches. I think that would be a very fascinating discussion, but I'm not aware of anything planned just yet. Does anyone know of something different?
Same here. Will be a very fascinating discussion.
And maybe I'll also just add that it would be also interesting for them to get together just to talk through the messaging of population projections, which I know that also IHME and others have received criticism for, and certainly creating population projections that are more aligned or working in closer collaboration with national statistical agencies would be an additional interesting point of discussion for them.
Wonderful, thank you, panel. We have time for one last question before we move on for Jay Gribble's closing comments. This is from Francis. The role of religious institutions and cultures in population is clear because of the ideologies. Are they consulted by the statistical bodies in order to drive community mindset change?
So maybe I'll just start that one off. You know, unfortunately, I think in the design of some of these assumptions, I'm not sure if there's really any kind of consultation with individuals that are important for influencing people's behaviors and attitudes. That's at least my perception. I'm not sure if anyone knows differently.
I'll also chip in on that. I think that is a question for program on how countries are able to derive programs to address their fertility challenges and also to be able to increase family planning uptake. But in terms of projections, the religious, cultural, all sects of community stakeholders are actually brought on board. The tools are being developed and they are consulted on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Stella, and we appreciate you, audience, for these wonderful questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'm going to now hand it over to Jay Gribble to wrap us up. Jay?
Thank you, Bethany. We've heard today about how fertility assumptions shape population projections. They use different approaches to craft their assumptions, and each leaves us with questions about how well recent trends predict future performance, including recent trends in fertility, educational attainment, and contraceptive unmet need. We've also learned, however, how important it is to take into consideration the unique features of a country when making projections about future population size and structure. A key reason for developing projections is to inform policy and planning. Identifying the appropriate policy pathway requires an idea of what the size and age distribution of a population is likely to be. Our long-standing work with the RAPID model has sensitized countless decision makers about the relationships between population size and the number of teachers, doctors, and nurses that will be needed, as well as schools and health facilities. An estimate of population size and structure matters when thinking about policies for taxation and expenditures, as Kaya mentioned. An issue as basic as the Social Security program in the United States in many ways boils down to a numbers game of how many workers there are or will be in the future relative to the size of the retired population. Environmental degradation and natural resource availability are shaped by population size and structure, as is managing investments related to infrastructure, considering links between population, urbanization, and transportation that impact so many aspects of quality of life in high fertility countries. An important observation about population projections and fertility assumptions is that regardless of how fast fertility falls and whatever influences its reductions, we need to ensure that women and couples have the right to decide on the timing, spacing, and number of children they have. Projections should help us understand the future, but not be used to set fertility targets. Finally, on behalf of the Health Policy Plus and PACE projects, we appreciate your attending today's webinar. I'd like to thank our presenters for their thoughtful insights, and we hope that you will stay tuned for our upcoming webinars, our range of policy, financing, stewardship, and accountability issues. Wishing you a good day, afternoon, or evening. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you back here next time.